Hey, read the disclaimer. Hey, fellas. Welcome to the first episode of the Brickbuilt archive. Hopefully, this will be a long standing series in which, as a history and fantasy nerd, rambles on about plastic minifigure armies and how to organize them so that your minifigure army is the best that there ever was. And whoever tells you otherwise is a fool whose mother was a hamster and his father probably smelt of elderberries. Bear with me, I didn't have a hamster figure. If you get this reference though, your social security number is probably in the hundreds. You're welcome. In this series, I'll be giving you all the tips I know and will be using history and fantasy sources alike to give you ideas to spice up your worlds and medieval armies, ranging from building techniques, parts to look out for, and everything I can think about. So sit tight, grab a glass of mead, and accompany me in our journey through this series, where I'll hopefully turn your Lego army from a bunch of blokes with swords and shields standing in a square formation to a formidable army of seasoned men ready to fight even the toughest of enemies. One of the most important things for any medieval army, aside from weapons and manpower, is some form to know who's a friend and who's a foe. Whenever your army is neatly displayed in a base plate behind your cupboard, this isn't a problem. They're standing next to each other, so they must be allies, right? Wrong. In the heat of battle, friends and foes become quite difficult to tell apart. Because of this, different armies throughout history have developed their own way to stand out from their foes and signal to their allies, "Don't shoot me, I'm on your side." This form of identification varies, and doesn't have to be fancy uniforms like in later eras. Medieval soldiers usually wore colors of the house they served, had visible badges, or other identifying marks. These usually varied somewhat between soldiers. This is because the methods in which medieval soldiers are levied is quite different from the later years. This is why medieval armies are quite interesting. Each soldier had to bring their own equipment. Think of it as a dinner party where everyone brings their own casserole, but instead of the repercussions of being unprepared, being disappointed guest, it's whether or not little Timmy returns home after 2 years of service. Now, for some people who are men-at-arms or otherwise well off, this isn't too much of a problem. They can afford some good gear to keep themselves alive or keep the enemy's sharp, pointy sticks from creating a new orifice in their body. However, not every peasant in the Middle Ages who was able-bodied was able to afford such. This is why levied soldier equipment could wildly vary. This is what I think makes or breaks an army. The variance in uniformity, the different helmets, the mismatching equipment. The more or less variance that your medieval army has, the more it tells you about the kingdom they serve. For the sake of simplicity, I'll be using the Lion Knights, mostly because it's the largest faction I own. But this can easily be extended to other factions, and even custom ones. So to answer our question of uniforms, the first thing we need to understand is the ranks and organization of our plastic military, not only to maintain order between the little buggers, but also because it will affect how the uniform they're wearing looks like, or would give us an idea to make each tier of the military distinct from each other. Firstly, you'd want a good majority of militiamen. These are folks who usually are able-bodied men, fitted with simple weaponry produced in mass quantities called munitions. Generally, I like to use some sort of leg that mismatches the original faction's colors, and tend to stray off from heavily armoring those men, as they tend to be more of the bulk of the army. I recommend that with militias, you stay simple. The mere hint of the fact that they belong to a faction is enough. For the Lion Knight's militia, you can use the torsos, or even repurpose a Viking torso, change the arms for red and blue arms, and with a little bit of imagination, and standing them next to the other Lion Knights, you can make it work quite well. The next step to the militia is the standing army, or the irregular soldiers. Now, these aren't common throughout the whole world in the medieval era, especially in the earlier part of it. Standing armies in the medieval era were groups of professional soldiers who weren't conscripts but instead were people who chose to shorten people's expiration dates for a living. These people usually had better equipment than the average peasant when it comes to making their job more efficient. With better equipment comes better, more distinguishable clothing. The bulk of the standing army still would be composed of people in the lower part of the food chain, fresher soldiers. In order to represent these kinds of soldiers and their ascended status of a bit more wealthy than dirt poor with Lego, it's quite simple really. For the Lion Knights you can just have the average knight pieces, without any heavy armor on. If you want to vary a little more, you can also use blue and red legs, or even combinations of such. I had to resort to this personally when Pick a Brick ran out of Lion Knight's legs. Generally, you'd want these folks' uniforms to be more consistent than, say, the militias and the irregulars. Afterwards, we start having the big guys. The ones that can make or break a fight. The men-at-arms, particularly the experienced standing army. Men who are usually fitted with better equipment, meaner weapons, and have more years of experience in the art of contacting people about expiring their life's extended warranty. These folks were well armed, and generally looked like a diet version of a noble knight. That doesn't mean they aren't to be feared though. This is where I believe using heavy armor is prime. The typical Lego armor piece works fantastically for some figures, but I recommend the newer pauldron pieces for any factions that have nice printed pieces. This way you can actually show the print rather than hide it. You can use the typical armor piece to your advantage though. A little tip from me is that you can still use non-castle minifigure pieces to make castle minifigures. All you need is a little bit of imagination and the right pieces to cover the prints. This Bear Knight, for example, actually has a police uniform underneath the armor piece. Will anyone notice? Not really.
No one but you will ever know about the sins you have just committed.
Finally, you have your noble knights, the generals and similar. With noble knights, this is where you truly get to splurge out. In my opinion, noble knights need to look varied yet cohesive. Similar banners, similar colors, but try to splurge out on how they look individually. I have made a couple of them for my lions, but my rule of thumb is that your nobles should generally be considered sig figs. Take the time to give them their own personality. Even if not a fully fledged sig fig, they should still feel like they have their own unique thing about them. Take the time to part them out and look for the right pieces for them. Don't be afraid of making some look wealthier than other nobles, as not every single one of them had the same amount of money to work with. Generally, it's a good idea to have a major figure like a baron, duke, or king surrounded by lesser knights, at least if you want to be accurate. You can use this neat little technique with a flower stud stuck between the feather piece and the connection of the great helm or a visor to add some flair to the piece and make it look more like a decorated plume. Now, obviously this is a gross oversimplification of the types of soldiers that you saw in armies. The culture of your army is also a factor that you need to consider. The ranks, social classes, organization of an army greatly determines what the gear they wear looks like. For example, you could have an army of peasants revolting against the local lord. These would probably have generally varied gear with simpler weapons such as flails and reforged scythes, and heavy expensive armor would be rarer. The important thing of any minifig army is finding the balance between order and chaos. You want there to be a trend that makes the soldiers distinguishably from a specific faction, whether that be colors, shields, or emblems, but you want every soldier to be a little different from the ones standing next to them. That way, when looking into the grand scheme of things, your army will look better and more realistic. As an additional note, I recommend to not pose your minifigures all the same. Vary them a little bit. Generally, a medieval formation wasn't pristine. People can't just hold in the same position without moving an inch. There will always be some variance. Some holding their spears pointing up, some having their helmet a little bit off center, some resting their shield on the ground. Whatever is important to keep comfortable. Also, remember that some archers have trained to shoot with the opposite hand. It was actually depicted as more common to hold the bow with your right hand instead of your left one. As a small side note, if you want to make a banner just like the one this fellow has, you can do so using these pieces. The bar goes through the 4-way brick, and you can connect the banners to it for extra security, with the little rounded plates at the ends. Always remember that you can leave some room for suspension of disbelief, and you don't need to stick to parts that are 100% belonging to a single faction. This shield that I have from the Rogue Knights from Knights Kingdom 2 fits quite well alongside the CMF Tournament Knight, and if you were to get some black and flame yellowish orange minifig parts, you can probably make yourself a good set of additional soldiers, considering that the minifig by itself costs over €25 on Bricklink. Well folks, that's all I have for you in this video. If you want me to go more in depth about any particular topic we've talked about, leave a comment below. If you like what you saw and want to see more, come check the rest of my channel, and consider leaving a like. I talk a lot about Lego, but I also talk about Minecraft, roleplay, and other topics that I happen to like. If you want to see more of the Brickbuilt archive, leave a comment telling me what do you want me to talk about next. I have a lot of ideas, but I'm always happy to see what else people want me to talk about. And without further ado, see you all next one.